106.5 WFMP. This is Community Control Now, the show seeking democratic community control of public institutions with a particular interest in the U.S. policing apparatus. I'm your co-host, Vincent Gonzalez. Mike T in the building. Say what's up to the people.
Power to the people.
Yep. Community Control Now seeks to end the rampant abuses by the state, which greatly target the persons of color and the economically disadvantaged. Community Control Now believes in all power to all oppressed people all over the world. For today's show, we got it's an honor and privilege here. Illustrious guest, Yanilda Gonzalez, Assistant Professor of Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. Your book, Authoritarian Police and Democracy, Contested Security in Latin America, speaks on the persistence of police forces as in authoritarian enclaves in otherwise democratic states. And this is huge for us. A couple of weeks ago, you had to speak with your class. And this is like, I'm gonna give you your flowers for a couple of seconds here. Just reading through this book. And you know, I consider myself a organizer activist on a local level here in Louisville, Kentucky. This beautiful work that you compiled, and I could just tell like the thoughtfulness that you put in it. I felt a sense of solidarity with persons in the global South because, you know, a lot of times, you know, Americans, we don't consider. I mean, I think, you know, feeling people, we know that this thing happens all over the world, but to the extent and you know, all the different parallels, like I said, I felt a great sense of solidarity. So Dr. Gonzalez, thank you so much for speaking with us here.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Vincent and Mike, and get an opportunity, like you said, to share a little bit about the commonalities and shared experiences that happen in societies that are unequal and where policing is disproportionately targeting folks who are, from racialized, minoritized, and impoverished communities. And that's something that we see similarly, whether it's in the U.S., Louisville, New York City, Sao Paulo, Bogota. It's a very similar set of patterns.
Yes. So just getting into it here, this work deeply examines the transition of the public safety apparatus in Latin America, namely Brazil, Argentina, and Colombia, from authoritarian to democratic rule. Could you highlight some of the key points you can share about this work, and we can just, sort of riff on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the kind of starting point for me, as a young person, as a teenager growing up in New York City, and then as a, in my early 20s when I moved to Latin America, I saw this something that was really puzzling for me, which was this persistence of police violence in democracies, whether we're talking about the US or Argentina, where I was living at the time, where you just saw really rampant abuses, sort of case after case of police killings. And this is despite the fact that there are supposed to be so many elements of democracy that are supposed to protect us from these kinds of abuses, right? Leaders have to depend on our votes, to stay in power. They, we're supposed to be protected by certain sets of rights. Institutions are supposed to be accountable, right? All these elements of democracy are, in my mind, that, as a young person at the time, told me that something was wrong here, that we shouldn't see this kind of police violence in countries that supposedly have these kinds of democratic protections, right? And so what I did was I began to research kind of how, particularly first in Argentina, then in Brazil, and then in Colombia, how did we end up with these types of police forces, despite the fact that these are otherwise, healthy democracies. And so one of the things that I started learning about as I did the kind of historical research was that there was really a seamless transition in policing from authoritarian, dictatorships to democratic rule. So even though in places like Argentina and Brazil, when they transitioned from, these very famous, famously repressive dictatorships, they had so many kinds of institutional transformations, particularly when it came to the military, But also they developed new constitutions. Brazil has one of the most protective constitutions in terms of rights. They have so many rights protections in that constitution. They have so many interesting, democratic participation elements of that constitution. But even though these countries took great pains to transform a lot of different institutions when they transitioned to democracy, policing largely remained the same. It was the same people, it was the same laws that governed policing, and it was the same practices. One part in the book, I trace the use of this, just again, this is not a pleasant subject, but a torture device in Brazil that came directly from the dictatorship, and similar, and the same in Argentina, the same torture device that was used by the dictatorship on people, which was, to deliver electric shock to people's bodies. It was seamlessly used by police in democracy as well. And the same in Brazil, sort of the same torture practices that were used by by agents of the dictatorial regime were similarly used in democracy, with continuity, right? With no questioning of how police carry out their practices. And so the same, it's not surprising then that the same violent practices would persist as well. When you have the same people, you have the same laws, and by and large, you have the same sets of rules and practices governing policing. And so if I could just continue briefly. So one of the things that that I then sort of started to read about was about policing in authoritarian countries, police in China, police in other parts in the world. And what I learned was that policing, as we saw it in democratic countries like Brazil, Argentina, even in many parts of the US, is that police isn't authoritarian just in terms of this arbitrary violence that we've been talking about. It's also other elements, right? The police serve the interests of political leaders, very often instead of serving the communities that ostensibly are the ones that they're supposed to be serving. And they're subjected to little to no external accountability. So it was these three elements of arbitrary use of force, without it being tied to the rule of law, serving the interests of political leaders, and no external accountability. These are the elements that led me to actually call policing authoritarian, even though we're in democratic contexts.
Sounds like America.
Sorry?
I said sounds like America in a lot of ways.
Yeah. We can find a lot of these similar patterns, in many cities around the US.
Absolutely.
And so one of the things that I argue in the book is that this persistence of authoritarian policing is not like an aberration of democracy, is not an oversight of democracy. It's actually a result of democratic processes. And so what I do in the book is kind of trace how the divisions in society, in unequal societies, such as we have in the US, such as we have in many parts, of Latin America, and many other parts of the world, mean that the way that large groups of citizens, particularly from more privileged sectors, they actually end up demanding a police force that is violent, that is unaccountable, and that protects them while repressing others. And so when you have elections, when you have democratic participatory processes, the outcome that will be yielded is one that will be fundamentally unequal in that respect. And so it will support the persistence of this unequal, unaccountable policing, despite the fact that democracy promises us that we ought to be protected from these kinds of abuses.
Yeah, one of the things that really stood out in your book is just, like I said, so many of those parallels, and in particular, just how deeply this thing tracks with race and class. Like you said, it's almost you could, dare I say, a completely different system that persons are under in the favelas, which are mostly Black. I mean, it was in what I know of police violence statistics in America, how, African Americans are only 13% of the population, but are over more than half of the unarmed police shootings. I think that I've noticed that with Brazil. I'm not as certain. I think of the three countries you mainly examined, Argentina was a little bit more ahead of things in terms of the reform, but I guess in particular Brazil is like the authoritarian sort of lens is kind of very much in place.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of these inequalities that you sorry, a lot of these inequalities that you mentioned definitely play out in similar ways, but they respond to the types of inequalities that you see in societies. And so in Argentina, one of the main sort of divisions is class. And so you see that where you have this sort of very stark class inequality, it doesn't mean that there's not racial diversity, it's just not very salient. It's not sort of yet an issue that is divides society in the way that we see here. But sort of you see that sort of by class and sort of where people live. So in the most low income areas is where you see the most police violence, and that studies that have been done on this mostly in the 90s. But folks who work on these issues, organizations that work on these issues today, say that these practices continue to fundamentally affect those that are, low income, working class, and living in low income communities known as villas. That these are the communities that most suffer these violence. And similarly in Brazil, we see the layering of race on top of that. And so, sort of year after year, we see, first of all, police violence rates in Brazil are much higher than what we see in the US. So in the US, you have about 1,100 police killings per year. At least that's what we know from the data sets that have been compiled by places like the Washington Post, mapping police violence, and other crowdsourced and media sources like that. It's about 1,100 in the last few years, from what we know. In Brazil, it's between 4,000 and 6,000, and that's despite the fact that they have 100 million fewer people. And so it's a much higher rates of violence, and the disproportionality is much like what we see here. So even the Black Brazilians are just over half of the population. Depending on the year, they're like 75 to 80% of the victims of police killings. And in the places where we've seen studies in terms of class, for example, in the state of Sao Paulo in 2017, one study found that about 75% of the victims of police killings had only completed primary education. And so we really see that this inequality in terms of class and race that you've been talking about, we see that playing out in the cases that I study in Latin America as well.
And it's just it's almost like it's deeply normalized in the society. There was one quote you quoted some officers you were in a ride along with, and what was that? You only get the day off if you kill someone. And it was just normalized as just but to have it in the thousands, like I said, and in American activists, we tend to sort of centralize things as this is just the epicenter of it. But I mean, the global South and all over this world, this is a deeply concerning thing, and that just yeah, man, your work opened my eyes to a lot of different stuff here. I'm gonna.
Could I just say something about that, Vincent, about this normalization?
Yes.
That was a really striking thing for me, is sort of seeing how often when I was with police officers and even sometimes prosecutors and the like, but mostly police officers, there was a lot of jokes about police violence, and then that to me sort of said it wasn't necessarily that like that particular officer is has engaged in this violence or anything like that. So I'm not making claims about their own involvement, but I think it does speak to the normalization of that this is something that people have naturalized, that it's sort of okay that this is part of policing. And so I sort of mentioned this to my students this past week, about the case of Iceland, where in 2013 there was a lot of reporting because the police there had killed someone for the very first time. So in the entire independence of Iceland, since the mid 20th century, the first time that the police killed someone was in 2013, and it was a national tragedy. It was a huge shock and a huge tragedy, and that's how it was talked about. And I sort of get us to have this thought experiment of like, what if in the US and Brazil, and we considered every person, each of these instances a national tragedy, and did everything to prevent these killings from happening. it's a very different reality, obviously, in lots of different ways, but it's just an invitation for us to think about what if we thought about police violence in this way, rather than the kind of more normalized way that we tend to think about it in the US.
I love that as a thought experiment, and it perfectly segues into the second question here in chapter 2. There's a section of your book, Unpacking Scandal. You argue that police misconduct scandals are not a function of the quality of a particular police force, nor of the level of police violence in a region. You further break down how the use of issue building around specific instances of police misconduct on the grassroots activist level has inconsistencies with overall structural change of the policing system in the U.S. and abroad. So if you could please just elaborate on that. And when I guess before you do that, Louisville, Kentucky in 2020, we had the tragedy of the Breonna Taylor case, and just a little background, which, gave to your class earlier. Mike's been in the struggle for decades here. I was a activist prior to those the uprising, probably about for the last about 15 or so years. So when that came along, it was like this big groundswell. And as we stand now, I talk to Mike about it all the time. It's as if nothing happened. So this unpacking scandals thing, and it's such a dice roll. You don't know. I think your book talks about middle class sensibilities. Like, it's this random confluence of factors that you have to hit in order to get the national media attention. So if you don't mind, please elaborating on that.
Yeah, one of the things that I always, scratch my head about is why do some cases become scandals? And what I mean by scandals is a case that people who are not typically attentive to policing suddenly start to pay attention. That people who are typically even maybe supportive of police and supportive of think police are doing a good job, they trust police, even they start to get concerned, and even they start to speak out. Because those of us that have been paying attention to this issue, as you, as Mike, we're always thinking about policing. We're always thinking about police violence. We're always concerned about it. We're always trying to talk to people about it. But there's a sort of segment in the middle that kind of, this is not a concern to them. They don't see it in their communities. They rarely see it in the media, and when they do, they might say, "Well, that person must have done something," and so there's certain events that come along and say to people, wait a second, something is wrong with policing, and we need to do something about it. Sort of after Ferguson, I remember reading a lot of interviews with particularly white Americans from different parts of the country who would sort of say, this is the first time that I've seen, that police, racially unequal, that the police are racially discriminatory. And there's this is a direct quote I remember from I think it was an elderly white woman possibly from the Bay Area. And she sort of had just come out of a community meeting of hearing her neighbor, a Black residents talking about their experiences with police. And she was like, I had no idea my neighbors felt this way. And in a unequal, segregated society like ours, we can see how that can happen, right? That you don't actually interact that much with people who are not like you, and so you don't know what their experiences are. And so these cases open up a whole world to people who are not typically exposed to this police violence. But the thing that always makes me scratch my head is sort of, why do some cases become a scandal and not others? And so, and sometimes we talk a lot about video, for example, as being one of the drivers. But yet when we compare, for example, the case of I always draw this example of Michael Brown, of course, which did not have a video, versus John Crawford III, who was killed just a few days before Michael Brown in August of 2014 in Beaver Creek, Ohio, and he was shot in a Walmart. He was walking around with like a toy gun. He was a 22-year-old, father, young Black man walking around with a BB gun or something, a toy gun, and in Walmart. And someone called the police, and within seconds,
Shot on
the
sight.
police,
Shot on sight.
shot on sight.
We were in the streets for that. It was, yeah.
Mhm.
And it just,
And it,
you can't track what's gonna touch the sensibilities of, and it, sometimes it's almost, it's craving, because it's like, we're waiting for them to kill someone else, and I don't want to, that doesn't pay any dividends for any social justice, or it's a lot.
it, Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. It's sort of that, the entire country knows who Michael Brown is. Even people outside, the entire world knows who George Floyd is. But why don't we know the name of John Crawford III? I mean, you do, I do, because we pay attention to these things. But that's the kind of question, is sort of, why do some, and that's why I kind of say, okay, what becomes a scandal is essentially random. We don't know what it is, the factors, and we can't say that it's things like video or even the characteristics of the victim. And so, but once something becomes a scandal, one of the things that I say is that even when you have widespread societal mobilization, that alone is not enough to guarantee reform. Sometimes you get what you get is a politician apologizing for the event. Maybe the officers get fired. Maybe the officers even get, as we just saw in Memphis, the officers may be fired, they may be charged, but does that lead to sort of structural change? I think it's not, unfortunately, it's not likely. And we see sort of over and over again how there's a failure of the political system to produce that kind of structural change in response to these cases that really do cause a widespread outrage and a demand for change. But what I argue and what I show in the book is that change is most likely to happen when politicians in power fear that they may be voted out of office over this. There's a very high profile case where the police were shown to be involved in the killing of a journalist. And obviously this is a very scandalous, a very concerning thing anywhere, but especially like in a democracy. And so it became a massive scandal immediately. And there were months of mobilizations, months of protests by all sectors of society. Unions are very big in Argentina. Unions were heavily out in the street. Different human rights organizations, lots of different sectors of society were out criticizing the police over this case. But over those first 9 months after the killing, all the governor did was to, acknowledge and express regret for the case, promise resources to investigate what happened, and sort of things of that nature. It was only after the 10th month, when his party lost the midterm elections, that he then committed to reform. And so that case shows us why sort of a scandalous event alone is not enough, and even widespread societal mobilization is not enough. You need, I argue, that politicians have to feel that they will lose office over this.
Yes.
And when they face that electoral threat is when I think they will become more likely to enact reform.
And in so many ways, they're scared of the police, which,
Yes.
which sort of just stamps what your book is saying. This authoritarianism, it tracks, it supersedes any social political sort of dimensions you would want to place upon it. And when we're coming within that, like I said, your book opened my eyes in so many ways, even though I try to follow these things as a concerned citizen, just as like, man, this is a beast. Like, I don't think when people speak on these things so cavalierly, we're like, I don't know you don't know who you up against. Like, this might be, dare I say, one of the biggest challenging apparatuses that needs to fall in order for us to have true democracy. We're police abolitionists, and we're to this place like we're not going to stop on that. Community control of the police is merely a reform pending a complete overthrow of these these systems. So I think that's all
Yes.
for now. Mike, you got anything?
Oh boy, very enlightening discussion. I probably would like to add that what we're confronted with now, especially after the global uprisings that began after the George Floyd case is that, and we see this here locally, that the system has actually bought off people, and they're buying them off by giving people millions of dollars after their family members are killed, which probably has the effect of not allowing them to pursue the broader issues. Just take the money and be thankful. And I also see, and I may have mentioned this in the previous discussion we had, a real selling out of the petty bourgeois black forces. And I think that relates to something you said earlier about when Vincent quoted you on the middle class sensibilities. We have a lot of black people who, consider themselves middle class, who have taken on those sensibilities, and they're as fearful of the underclass and the working class and crime just like any white middle class person. And they are, or evidently have, just abdicated to the policing powers that be. Abolition apparently is off the table, if it ever was, in those circles. Any type of control of the police. They apparently just seem to be content with just changing the color of the police forces, firing police chiefs and that sort of thing, even though many of the black petty bourgeoisie are much more connected to this police repression than the white petty bourgeoisie, because of the racial divisions. But it seems like they have abdicated their responsibility, and then the absence of a strong organization of working class people fighting for this, excuse me, we're not going to get any kind of substantial reform. Because if you notice, I don't know if you've been following, some of the struggles of the black community. Police repression is not even being talked about like that. They'll talk about the individual cases, when these scandals pop up. But the whole question of abolition, police control, that is like off the table now. And we can't allow them to do that.
I couldn't live with myself, This is serious, and the fight continues in so many ways. Dr. Gonzalez, any final thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that I might just say in response to what Mike shared is that one of the other big puzzles is sort of, why is it that we sometimes see communities that are affected by police violence make demands for more police, make demands, what seems to be taking stances against limiting police power, and we see this similarly in the U.S. and in Latin America. And I think that part of that is that, first of all, everybody wants to be safe. Everybody wants to be safe, and everybody has a right to feel safe and to be protected from violence and crime. But part of the problem is that sort of in our society and in others, the only thing that people are told sort of by our political leaders, the only solution that you can have to solve crime is police. And so even though we know and research shows that there's lots of other policy areas that we can, social policies, there's spatial policies, there's all kinds of urban landscapes, there's things, social programs, there's community organizations and education. There's all these types of policies that play a role in reducing crime. But the only solution that people are given so often is police. And so they say, well, I'm scared of being a victim of crime, or I have been the victim of a crime. If the only solution that you're offering me is more police, then give me more police. And so I think it's that a lot of communities are left without, by our political leaders, because obviously a lot of organizations like yours are out there telling people about what other options there are. But by our political leaders, we're by and large left with policing as the only solution to crime, even though a lot of research shows that there's lots of different, programs and policies that could be undertaken to reduce crime and violence. And so I think that it's part of that is sort of expanding our own imaginations about what policies, what does safety look like, beyond policing, because policing is they kind of only know how to do one thing, and that's use force. And so the question is, can you solve every problem by using force? Can you solve the problem of, of schooling, mental health, of homelessness, of all these things? Is force the only thing we can come up with to solve all these different issues? We need to expand our imagination, I think, and think about what other policy solutions do we have for these issues that are, concerning, but which for the only solutions that our government seems to be putting forth is more police.
Yes. I mean,
That's
just,
what they're doing.
yeah. And
They'd rather shoot the problem than solve it.
yeah.
Or lock the problem up.
Yeah. And we, like I always say this, like, thinking, feeling people of the world, we have a choice. We have an obligation to tell the truth and speak against these things. So Dr. Gonzalez, thank you. It's beautiful work that you're doing. We appreciate everything, and we hope that this is not the last time in the shared struggle that we have. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Vince, and thank you, Mike, so much for having me on your program.
Right on. Community Control Now signing off.